Many people know about the places where men are imprisoned from movies, books, newspapers, or anywhere else. Everyone has heard something or even gone through this difficult school of life. Few people know about women's prisons, and probably only the prisoners and their relatives. Information also comes from official sources, but, as we know, their truth can be very different from reality. So what really happens in women's correctional institutions in Russia? It is worth noting at once the fact that this situation is plus or minus the same in all countries of the former USSR. The system was the same, and it has remained virtually unchanged. What happens in women's colonies? Of course, the hardest thing is the impossibility to realize their plans, to be in the mass of other women. Women, as representatives of the fair sex, cannot even decorate the place where they sleep. It is forbidden. Everything must be in strict compliance with the requirements of the correctional institution. Otherwise, violations can be penalized. But the thing is that the punishment applies not only to the offender herself, but also to all the others in the cell. They, of course, will not like it and can somehow take revenge. Surveillance is constant, and even the most secluded place cannot be found. Everyone is with everyone and in full view of everyone else. For violations, the administration can inflict various kinds of torture, and one of the most common is the inability to visit the toilet, and to such an extent that the woman feels pain. One of the humiliating practices is also searches. A woman is stripped naked, forced to squat and searched in all places. Naturally, the issue of hygiene is also acute. Like men, women visit the bathhouse once a week. But the latter are still desirable to carry out such activities more often. One can only imagine what odor the inmates have to constantly be in the room. There are also other punishments from the administration, more physical in nature, from banal beatings to damaging personal belongings and shaving naked. Prisoners could have 1 day off a week and even 2 weeks vacation. Naturally, this does not apply to the strict regime. In general, throughout the day, women work, eat, and prepare for the time off. There is, of course, and free time, but it is very conditional. The thing is that they try to keep everyone busy somehow, with some kind of social activity. And this, by the way, is not a bad thing. For example, in Great Britain, on the contrary, in a women's prison, convicts have almost nothing to do, which leads to a higher level of violence among them. Both women and men can be hit in prison. However, the latter do it more often. Domestic problems are limited mainly by the lack of privacy, and, as many female prisoners say, this is the biggest problem. In modern prisons, the administration tries not to abuse and torture even the most delinquent prisoners. They act simply. For example, they cut off hot water for everyone or do not let them wash for a long time, for weeks. Almost always it works. You should not think that if the colony is a women's colony, it will be somehow special. They will treat them more humanely. Most often, it's not so. Here they literally show with all their appearance that prisoners are not human beings. In colonies, they often additionally limit the freedom of a person. For example, they introduce various rules that are not prescribed in the statute, create an inappropriate daily schedule, etc. Often, all this is accompanied by complication of everyday life, modified search procedures, humiliating women's dignity, etc. Of course, it can be different in colonies, but the principle of infringement of the rights and freedoms of female inmates applies everywhere. At the same time, as some old-timers of prison life admit, it was much easier, if not easier, in the USSR. You knew how you would be punished. For example, if you committed a minor offense, you would be given 15 days of shiso, and if you were seriously delinquent, you would be sent to the punishment cell. Back then, everything was at least clearly regulated. The legal sanctions in the colony are still punishment cells and shizo. As detainees admit, one would not wish even an enemy to go to a shizo because the conditions there are so bad. According to the law, they can be put there for 15 days at a time, for a maximum of 2 months a year in total. But almost any administration has additional cells where unwanted persons are also placed, and most often several people at a time. There were cases when women were kept in such cells for several months. By the way, if some female detainees are not broken by the shizo, they can be transferred to a special detachment where they will be kept for a long time and with the worst possible conditions. But one has to give credit to some of the staff. There were many cases when they fed prisoners, took pity on them, and in every possible way eased the conditions of detention. But this rarely happens, and it is understandable why. Not all the prisoners are lovely women, but quite criminals who, in terms of the number and cruelty of crimes, would give a head start to men. Hierarchy in women's prisons. The way of life in a women's colony is very different from that in a men's colony. There are no clear concepts here, and all relationships here are built somewhat differently, but this applies to modern prisons, not to Soviet prisons, where everything was much more complicated. In the USSR, starting in the 30s, there were concepts and a clear hierarchy, but still not as complex as the male hierarchy. In the colonies, women had blatniks, downcastes, and devils. Many people are probably familiar with the term thief. It is from those times. It meant a professional criminal, although some people still call themselves that, but it's not common. Blatniks in women's prisons could work, unlike in men's prisons. The devils were called mushrooms. They were a little higher in status than the lowered. They usually included female prisoners who didn't take care of themselves. They were humiliated and mocked. The youngest were called peas. They also did dirty work, but they were paid for it in the form of tea, cigarettes, coffee, and they were protected. The omitted in women's prisons were those who in the outside world engaged in prostitution or simply gave themselves thoughtlessly to everyone. They were not allowed to share food with them. They were not allowed to eat at the same table. They were avoided and avoided contact. But the most disrespected and hated were the murderers of their children. They were not just mocked, but tried to injure and even kill them. In modern times, the most authoritative and respected female prisoner is the one who has been in jail the longest. As in men's prisons, female recidivists are segregated from first-time offenders. Usually a senior woman, the so-called supervisor, is appointed only with the approval of the administration. She is the link that connects the other female inmates with the colony authorities. In principle, this is the end of the hierarchy in a modern women's colony. Everyone simply obeys the chief, who assigns cleaning duties, schedules work, stops violence, and performs other similar functions. One of the most notorious and shocking crimes against convicts was committed relatively recently. Human rights activists got their hands on videos of rapes of women by FSIN officers. All the abuse took place in the Saratov Hospital of the Federal Penitentiary Service. Moreover, these were not isolated cases, but rapes were committed on a regular basis. According to human rights activists, about 40 gigabytes of video material was filmed with the employees who committed the crimes. Naturally, they were not the ones who shot the videos. They were recordings from service recorder cameras. The case became high profile, and Alexander Kalashnikov, who was then the head of the Federal Penitentiary Service, was removed from his post. A lot of criminal cases were also initiated and many hats flew off.